In this video, we're going to look at the random sampling software assignment, and this is going to be the SAS version. So before you get started, there's two files that you need off of Canvas. The first one is the random sampling SAS file that's going to have the SAS script in it. The other one is the data set, so the inpatient COVID data set. So you'll want to get both of these files off of Canvas, and I'm going to highly recommend that you save those in a folder that you have dedicated for this class. So you don't want to always be downloading files off of Canvas and storing them in your downloads. You do want to have a specific folder on your computer where you're storing everything for this class, or even better, maybe subfolders within there. Maybe you have a folder for the notes, one for assignments, and so on. If you're not sure how to set that up on your computer, contact me. I'm more than happy to help you set that up, but that will make your workflow a little bit easier if you have a dedicated folder. Alright, so right here I have opened the random sampling SAS file. So you should have this already opened in SAS. And the first thing you'll notice up here at the top is I have a couple comments. It's always a good idea when writing any kind of script or writing code to just have some comments up at the top to remind you what this file was for. So I'm going to add in my name. This is the software assignment random sampling, and then today is the 20th, so I'll put in the 20th. So the first thing we're going to do is import that data set. So in order to do this, this is why it's important that you know where that file is located on your computer. You'll notice right here inside of the quotations, I have a location or a path file on my computer. And this is where I have the data set stored. And you'll notice, so I have mine stored in CPH 603, Spring 21, Module 2, and then this last part is the name of the file. So yours should end just like mine does in inpatient_covid.csv, but the part before this will be the path to the file, or to the location where you have the file stored on your computer. You could also use the import wizard as well to get this data set in. So let's run this. Alright, so we've ran it, I don't have any red up here, and now let's do some data checks. So first thing I'm going to do is just print out the data set, and I'm going to look at it. So you'll notice here we have 51 observations, we have all of the states, and we also have DC, and then we have the number of beds that are currently occupied by COVID patients. So I'm going to close that. So my data looks good. One thing to keep in mind, if in the proc import statement, if you get an error, one common error is that you cannot have this file open in Excel at the same time you run it in SAS. So if you get an error, double check that you don't have the file open in Excel. If you do, just close out that file in Excel and rerun this. Alright, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to consider these 51 data points. We're going to think of them as a population. It's a pretty small population, but we're going to look at it for illustrative purposes. So the very first thing I'd like to do is explore the population data. So to do this, I'm going to use the procedural statement called Univariate. And we'll see more about this later on in the course, but the Proc Univariate statement, what it does is it looks at a single variable, so univariate, and it gives us some summaries. So using the proc univariate, I'm going to call data equals bed data. So the reason I'm doing this, if we go up to my proc import statement, notice that I named the part of the data set bed underscore data. So that's why I have bed underscore data. The work dot at the beginning of this is actually telling SAS where to store it. SAS has a default folder called the work folder that it stores things in. So the actual name of the data set is bed underscore data. So let's look at this and notice the variable we're interested in is beds. So I'm going to run this. We get a whole bunch of information. We're just going to look at a little bit of it. Capital N tells me how many observations were read in. So there were 51, so that's good. That matches. Let's look at the mean. So notice there were 2,581, about was the average for the number of beds occupied. And then we could also look at things like the standard deviation, which we'll talk about more later on in the course, and we could look at the median. So notice the mean is also given here, and so is the median. So you can find some of the information in more than one spot. So again, our mean is about 2,581 and our median is 1,325. All right, so now let's go back to our SAS code. And what we're going to do is we're going to make a histogram of the variable beds. So to use this, we're going to use the procedural statement that's called proc sgplot. So we call the procedure. I'm going to tell it the same data set that we've been using. I'm going to give my histogram a title. So I'm going to call this one COVID-19 Estimated Hospital Capacity by State on 1/9/2021 N equals 51. I'm going to make a histogram of the variable beds. And then the rest of this, what this is controlling is the width of the bars, the color, the X, and the Y axis. So we're not going to do too much with this histogram right now. Later on in the course, we'll learn a lot more about histograms, how to make them look nice, and things like that. So, but for right now, I'm giving you the code. You shouldn't have to make any edits to this. So we're going to click on Run. And notice that we get a nice looking histogram. So a couple things that I want to look at with this histogram is kind of the overall shape. So remember, we're looking at the number of beds. So if we look here on the left hand side, we can see that about 68% of the states have beds in this range. And then as we go down, we can see that there is a much smaller percentage of states that have the number of beds here in this range. So this is what we call right skewed data. So we see kind of this overall shape of what the population data looks like. So again, what I really want to focus on here is just the overall shape or the overall look of the histogram for the population data. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to take a random sample from our population, and what we hope is that if we take a random sample, the characteristics of the random sample will be similar to that of the population. So notice here I've got a comment that says explore the first random sample data, so we're going to take our first random sample. So to do that, we're going to use the procedural statement called proc surveyed select. My data is going to be my bed data. Method is SRS, so simple random sampling. And N, that tells me how many I want in my sample. So in this case, I want 25 in my sample. And then the data set that I'm going to output, I'm going to call it random sample 1. So let's run this. Okay, so it ran. So notice it gives me a little bit of output down here. And now let's look at what our random sample looks like. So here's our random sample. Notice it has observations 1 through 25, so that's exactly what we were looking for. So now let's explore our first random sample and see if we get something similar to our population. So the first thing I'm going to do is run that Proc Univariate on the beds variable again. I'm going to look at the mean and the median and see if the mean and the median of my first random sample are similar to that of my population. All right, so here is my new mean and my median. My new mean is 2,622 and my median is approximately 15,000. So if we scroll back up here, notice that these are fairly close to what was happening in the population. They're not drastically different. Now they're not going to be exactly the same because we know that we're only looking at a piece of the population, so my sample isn't going to be exactly the same. We are seeing that mean and that median are similar. So now let's look at a histogram. So looking at the histogram, again, notice the only real difference from what I had up top when I made the histogram is I've changed my data set to be random sample 1, and now I'm looking at n equals to 25 instead of 51, so I've changed that to 25. Everything else I've kept the same. So I'm going to highlight this and I'm going to run it. And notice here the overall shape of my sample is very similar to that of my population. Is it exactly the same? No. And notice one of the things we've missed is this bin all the way out here is now empty. But this kind of makes sense that this might happen because in my population I had very few observations all the way over here on the right. So it's less likely that my population is going to pick up elements from way out here in the right. This happens a lot when you have what is called skewed data. And so we'll learn about what a skew is later on in the course, but essentially it means that most of our data is in one place and we have fewer observations out in our tail. So going back here, this is actually, that needs to be deleted out. That won't be in your copy. So for the assignment, you have to take 4 random samples. So we've already got 1 random sample here. Let's look at how we would go about taking that second one. To take the second one, just start here at this comment, highlight, copy that, and then down below paste. And we're going to make just a couple edits. Well, right now we're not going to take a first random sample. We're going to take the second random sample. Right? And so we're going to select a random sample of 25 states using the sample function. But this time I don't want to output random sample 1 because that would override the first random sample we took. Instead, I want my new one to be called random sample 2. And so now down here, everywhere that I've called the data set, I want to change this over to random sample 2. And that's the only change that we need to make to take our second random sample. So let's do that. So notice now we've got our second random sample. So let's go up to the top. And we should see that we have some differences between the two. So notice my first couple states, my first random sample were Alabama, Arkansas, and Arizona. We see that they are the same here, but they're in a different order. So let's keep on going. Oh no, I'm sorry. The first one isn't Alabama, it's Alaska now. So see, we have picked up, sorry, I was making sure my abbreviations are there correct, but we can see that we do have some slight changes here and that our 2 random samples are not exactly the same. So we are getting a different random sample. And then we could go through just like we did before, look at the Proc Univariate and the histogram. And again, we're seeing that the overall shape is similar, but there is some what we call variability in between our samples. So, in general, they look similar, but they're not exactly the same. And that's really the key point of this assignment, is to actually see that when we take random samples, those samples usually are going to be similar in characteristics to the population, and they'll also be similar to one another, but there is going to be what we call variability from one to the next. And one of the key ideas in statistics is accounting for that variability. So this is going to conclude this video. As with any of the videos, if you need any help or you have any questions, please let me know.